my colleague, Ukrainian artist Darja Lukjanenko, and Darja prepared for us a lecture on the topic Ukrainian culture in warm time. And Darja is studying at Prague specifically in studio of photography by leading Sasha White. And it's your.
Thank you so much for inviting and introducing me. Hello, everyone. My name is Darja Lukjanenko. I'm a Ukrainian artist. Currently, I'm in my last year of master program. Before, I studied journalism, and now I'm studying visual arts. I would like to start with the online map. You can find it by the website Alerts in UA. And for me, sometimes it's very hard to combine in my head two worlds. One world is what's going on here, and one world what is going at home. And this web, for me, is very helpful to combine these two worlds in all this surrealism reality. And on this map, you can see regions in which air raid alarm currently on, which means that right now in these regions in Ukraine, some bombing, some shelling going on. So we can see Kharkiv, Lugansk, Vinnytsia, Ternopil, and Khmelnytsky. Okay. This map is from 2 days ago, when the shelling was all over Ukraine. Mostly for some reason it happens in the early morning times when everyone home, and sometimes at night. So sometimes when I check in this map at night, I see it's all red. I wanted to talk a bit at the beginning about my motivation. Since the open invasion started in February this year, I found this all my friends and people I know and my neighbors and probably all people in Ukraine changed somehow their practice towards be more socially useful and to find a way to help other people and be useful nowadays. So my friends from the Dnipro, the city in the eastern central Ukraine, mostly artists, musicians, getting involved into volunteers activities or even some military activities. Here I asked them to send me photos I can use for this lecture just to show what my friends artists currently doing now. So here is they are trying to cozy up some bomb shelter in the old Soviet Palace of Culture. This photo I got in the first days of invasion from a friend of mine, musician Hala, and here she is doing Molotov cocktails. I like this photo also because it shows that this activity of making Molotov cocktails, it's something like cargo activity, because it was clear you can use Molotov cocktail against tanks or against aviation. But by collecting together on the squares, people will find some comfort, or also some things they can do together and support each other. So it's actually a very crazy and weird activity, but it gave a lot of togetherness in the first days of open invasion, and that's why I think it's very nice to document it. It is one interesting fact about this activity that on the government website, it was published recipe for Molotov cocktail. So when you was going to check whatever, like your bills for apartment or some news, you was able to download the recipe, which usually restricted or kind of censored information, I guess. This is photos I got from my family. It's what they were doing this spring and this summer. I got this from my dad, who is in ordinary life, he's beekeeper, and now he's involved into creating anti-tanks hedgehogs. I'm very glad you came today because this lecture for me, it's my way to do something useful and do something good and contribute against Russian imperialism. So by letting it happen today, I feel like I'm doing small contribution, and I'm very thankful for you to make it happen. On this slide, you can see two works which were made in the one time. And for me, it's a perfect illustration about why it's important to give a voice to Ukrainian artists. So both works were born in the March of 2022, were inspired by same events, but picture from the left was made by Ukrainian artists, and the cover from New Yorker, of course, was created by so-called like Western artists from New Yorker team. And I really like how the moods and how the visual narratives are different. And I really like to use it to show that, that voices from the local environment and outside environment can be very different, and ideas and the narratives can be even like polarly different this way. When I did first version of this lecture, it was in the March, April of the 2022, and it was very new terminology towards this war, like as a colonial war. So it was not validated yet by medias, it wasn't validated yet by international thinkers community, but after 6 months passed, now the colonial war terminology is completely connected to Russian-Ukrainian war. The same is that some racist or fascist ideology is also validated in connection to Russian-Ukrainian war too. Another thing for which is not validated yet, but which is same important, is terminology towards Russian politics, which is named it as a terrorist state. It is already first step happens toward validating it, and Lithuania adopts resolution calling Russia terrorist state. In the USA, it is a discussion opens towards calling Russia terrorist state, but still it's very fresh, so we will see how it will develop, and if it will be accepted, and it will be validated the same way as a colonial and fascist, racist terminology. I wanted to talk a bit why it's very important to call this war some specific way, and why it's making sense, and why it's so important for Ukrainians not to call it conflict in Ukraine, or not to call it just situation in Ukraine, but call it Russian war in Ukraine. Since the fall of Soviet Union, it was almost every year some war in which Russia was involved. And because these wars like war in Georgia, war in Chechnya, war in Armenia, war in Moldova, none of them were called proper way, like Russian war in Moldova or Russian war in Georgia. A lot of people left without like acknowledging the aggressive dynamics and the military dynamics in Russian politics. And that's why the way to call this war exactly like Russian war in Ukraine, it's very important because it gives some historical justice, and also it gives publicity, awareness about who is involved with this war, who is participating, who was starting it, and so on. This lecture is about decolonization processes, and as a very symbolical beginning, I wanted to start with first step, classic for decolonization, is bringing identities, national identities, to artists for whom it was important. And the two key artists very symbolical for this process in Ukraine is Kazimir Malevich and David Burluk. Unfortunately, if you will check Wikipedia, even now, like English version, any international version, you will find those artists as Russian artists. But if we will make deeper research, we will find that those artists themselves identify them verbally and written as a Ukrainian artist. For example, Kazimir Malevich, who was born in the village near Kyiv, was living in this village with his family until he was 17 years old, was going in the Kyiv Academy for studying arts, then moving to St. Petersburg to continue his education, was always defining himself as a Ukrainian artist. Same goes with David Burluk, who internationally known as a father of Russian futurists, but he defined himself as a Ukrainian, Cossack, and Tatar. So while starting with decolonization, it's always touching somehow these two persons, and actually already some movements in this sphere happened, and if you will check on Tate archive, you will find Kazimir Malevich there as a Ukrainian artist. Currently, same discussion going on with MoMA about bringing back Kazimir Malevich identity. This is not the most famous Kazimir Malevich painting. This doesn't mean they are less important. Here you can see his painting inspired by historical events happens in Ukraine and the beginning of 20th century, which had a lot of repressive crisis features. And on the first and the second one, you can see pictured village person, farmer, which was running or like struggling somehow from the new era happened, collectivization processes probably, and so on. This precedent can be very inspiring for decolonization process at all, because in this precedent, the picture was renamed long after outer death, and this precedent happened in the March of 2022, when a friend of mine and Ukrainian culturologist Mariam Nayem found that a very famous and big series of Edgar Degas called Russian Dancers, still calls like Russian dancers in the big galleries all around the world, but it's very clear that on the picture, on this painting, there are Ukrainian dancers or dancers in Ukrainian national costumes. And as a part of this decolonial process or historical justice, cultural justice, she made a letter for all the galleries this series is exhibited, and explained the situation and explained that there are also cultural part of this word, and it's very important to save parts as a national costume or national identity, even if it was misleading in the past. So this renaming kind of made a new precedent for decolonization process, and yeah, it's bringing a big inspiration and showing that it's actually very possible now to start a dialogue and bring cultural justice. Even the case is so complicated as with Edgar Degas, who pictured Ukrainian dancers or Russian dancers in Ukrainian costumes and called this picture Russian dancers by himself. But this precedent is following some already existing ones. For example, we're in an issue which is touching some modern ethics standards or modern tolerance standards. For example, when existing pictures somehow offending some categories of people or became just ethically impossible, like for modern ethics. So following this precedent, this renaming was happened. I wanted to talk today about Ukrainian modern art and Ukrainian art in wartime. But I think to understand it, it's very important to know few key events. And I thought I will make a small trip through the 20th century And through the perspective of some events happening fast, we will take a look on the modern art pieces to understand it better. One of the aims of this lecture is myth-busting some things Russia using as a part of propaganda process, and probably the most popular one, the most shared one, is Russian and Ukrainians are brotherhood nations or brothers, and I always commenting on it in my lecture because I think it's very important to not support of propaganda narrative, and if we will looking for metaphors or for definitions for relationships in between Russia and Ukraine, not in this century but at all, that it's probably will be more fair to call it colony and empire, oppressor and oppressed, and never brothers or sisters, because all the feature of economical, cultural repressions, political repressions, genocides have nothing to do with any kind of metaphorical brotherhood. Here you can see from the right the picture which is kind of embodied this propaganda narrative about all Russian nations or Russian Trinity. Maybe you heard somewhere or seen somewhere from the past, like Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, sisterhood, brotherhood, whatsoever. So this is kind of embodied in it, and as you see, that's only flag on the background, which is not, of course, a mistake or surprise, because this propaganda narrative develops from there are three brothers or three sisters. There are older brothers and small brother and smaller brother, and then in the end there are right brother and wrong brothers, and right brother should teach them a lesson or whatever, just like clean it up or take rule and punish, something like this. So every time I hear it somewhere, and I know it was very popularized in 20th century, I'm trying to explain why it's not working this way and why nobody in Ukraine feels like we're brothers and sisters. And for me, it's of course also a personal story, because part of my family is from Russia. So like in real life, of course, I have some nieces and some uncles from Russia. But I think in political sphere and for metaphors, it's very important to define it a more realistic way. And here you can see proofs of how strong this propaganda theory is. It's so-called Three Sisters Monument, which was installed in Ukraine in 20th century on the border with Belarus and Russia, and it symbolized this Russian three unity, big Russian and small Russians together. And that was a precedent with this monument this year, of course, because since Russia and Belarus involved in the military aggression, it was unbearable for people to see this monument, and especially it was in Chernihiv region, which got very damaged by Russian army. So the big discussions started what to do with it and how many sisters from this monument should be demonetized. So some people offered demonetized one part, like one stela, like demonetized Russian sister, and keep Belarus and Ukrainian, like it's not everything lost. Some people offered demontage Ukrainian stela and say that, okay, like Russian and Belarus stays sister if they wanna, and Ukraine is going. And some people, of course, offer to demontage all of them because this propaganda narrative was used already in very evil processes. And this is why some Ukrainians got a bit upset from Nobel Peace Prize decision this year, which was published a few days ago. So it's very fresh news. And this year, Nobel Peace Prize went to Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia activists. And even there is a big respect in between all these activists in these three countries who are fighting for freedom, justice, and human rights. but still from Ukrainian side is like this re-traumatizing feeling through seeing that it framing these two countries again in this all trinity, all three Russians context together. The first event I want to back in time is Holodomor, and it was happened in almost like 100 years ago in 1932, 1933. And according to Holodomor Museum information in Ukraine, there are almost 7 million people died from famine caused by Communist Party and Soviet state policies. What is very important for this event that these years were extremely fruitful and extremely good for farming. So in these years, Ukrainian farmers got a lot of bread, a lot of like huge harvest. So everything seems like any famine is impossible. And there are some documents which are proving this, some memories and so on. But because it was part of Soviet Union politics on collectivization or maybe on preventing Ukrainian people from uprising, because it were like first decades of Soviet Unions and Ukrainians was not like really happy about this. So this artificial famine was provided and the huge amount of victims happened after all. It is interesting that this year Czech Republic made an official statement about Holodomor as a genocide of Ukrainian people caused by Soviet government. And it's still very interesting and important that Russia, till this very days, denies it ever happened. So even there exist multiple proofs, and from the international scene and spectators, Russia somehow succeeding the position of Soviet Union in it and following very line which was established 100 years ago that it never took place. I was very amazed by this picture. I knew that Kazimir Malevich was picturing a bit of Ukrainian farmer's life in his early career. And this one of the his pictures which some culturologists connect to these Holodomor events. So it calls by the line from the folk song from 30s, and it says, "Where hammer and sickle are, there are death and famine." And you can see that there are no faces on the figures, and it's only Soviet Union emblem, cross, and a coffin instead of faces. So that's early Kazimir Malevich. One of my favorite projects connected to this topic, it's Uncounted, and it doesn't contain any terrifying photos or written memories. It only contains collection of recipes of people who survived Holodomor and photos which are recreating these recipes. And yeah, for me, it's one of the most like touching archive connects to this topic. It is important that Russian current government not only succeeding Soviet position in this famine situation, but it's also somehow copying strategies to have an impact on the people and have an impact on the war. And some strategies are that much same that it's impossible not to remember Holodomor in connection to it. For example, at the spring and summer, it was a lot of news about Russia stealing Ukrainian grain. Then when it was harvest time, there was a lot of bombing aimed on the fields to damage the harvest. Then finally the grain export deal with the international side was signed about Russia will not bomb Ukrainian ports and will let the grain go out so people who are waiting for this grain will have a possibility to get it. And one day after signing grain export deal, it was broken because Russia bombed the port. Here is a project of mine, which is very connecting to these events and to whole process of this terror through the food and through the bread. It's called The End of the World Bread. And in this project, I recreated the recipe of my grandmother. And while making the bread, following this recipe, I add a bit of soil collected in the first day of invasion. And I was offering this bread as a social sculpture for people who visiting the art show, so they can decide what to do with it, like try it or leave it as a sculpture. And it was, of course, a warning that the bread contains the soil. But to my surprise, the biggest part of the bread was consumed in the first day of the show. And while discovering this bread recipe, I also discovered part of family story I never was aware about. So it became even more symbolical to me. I always saw that part of my family is from Russia. So I'm half Russian, half Ukrainian. But I discovered that actually the part of my family who is from Russia, they were Ukrainians 100 years ago, and they were deported from the eastern Ukraine to Russia in the beginning of 20th century, as a lot of Ukrainians these days. And it is very crazy that same processes going now in the eastern Ukraine, and people are getting forcibly deported from the eastern Ukraine regions, so history of terror somehow repeats itself. Talking about terror right after the Holodomor, it was so-called Great Terror, initiated by Stalin government, where people were arrested, and about 2/3, according to official documents, of course, were executed, but we will never know how many were executed for real. And in Ukraine, this time called Executed Renaissance. This photo is one of the symbols of Great Terror and Executed Renaissance, because it's picturing family of Ukrainian intellectuals. And each one of them was important figure for theater, writing, poetry, music, and almost like shorter than in 10 years, almost all of them were executed. So this time was calling Executed Renaissance. It is a building important for this era, for this 10 years. It's located in Kharkiv, and it's called Slovo building, because in Ukrainian as well as in Czech, Slovo is word. So it started as a very nice project, very modernistic and maybe even futuristic for the beginning of 20th century. The idea was to create a building in which all the writers, poets, and cultural figures will live, create together, collaborate, and and have a fruitful life. So that was the official idea. Then, when the building was inhabited by the brightest minds, it fastly became the place for government to spy on people, to make some kind of reports, to create some net of looking for a nationalistic or anti-Soviet figures in it. So somehow it became a zoo, or maybe like a prison somehow, or pre-prison for all the most important cultural figures, which made very easy for like Soviet government to spy on it and control them. And in the end, like almost all the inhabitants were executed as a part of Executed Renaissance. It is a movie dedicated to this house and historical events from 2017, and it is a photo, the last one. It's from the March of this year, and it's showing Slovo building damaged by Russian forces in 2022, this year. So when I seen this building and other people to see like the photos of this building, it was very real feeling about that this building became of monument of like totalitarian victims or got damaged by totalitarian regime twice, one time in last century and this time in this century. Actually, before the invasion started, it was very interesting cultural place because part of them still inhabited by ordinary people, just Kharkiv citizens, and part of them were working as a residency for writers who was interested to work with the totalitarian trauma or some totalitarian related stories. So the part of the building were open for writers all around the world to come and make their research or create something inside of this building. It is a super good website dedicated to this building, and if you got interested, I very recommend proslovo.com. It is existing in English version. It's very beautifully done, and it contains a lot of documents and memories and interesting facts about. So hopefully it will survive occupation, deoccupation, and it will back to its mission, and the residency will start all over again. Another important event is Revolution of Dignity, which was started in 2013 as a peaceful protest. And then after it was forcibly suppressed by the government, pro-Russian government with the president Viktor Yanukovych, it became in the enormously huge, historically probably the biggest protest in Ukraine, where thousands of people went out of the streets, and they made a pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych leave the country and initiated the democratic re-elections. Right after the Revolution of Dignity was ended, Russian forces were entering Crimea, Lugansk, and Donetsk regions and occupied them. So right after this, the Russian-Ukrainian war started. So it's also very important comment because this year I heard a lot about people were terrifying. It is a war in Europe, started this year, and it wasn't for so long time here, and it's actually shocking. And I knew that war in Europe is going on for 8 years already. And I think it's also important to keep this 2014 in mind, just to support historical justice and to not forget that occupation started much earlier than in 2022. And here you can see a picture of Ukrainian artist Kinder album, which is picturing modern war mythology. It is an anonymous author. By the legend, nobody ever seen who is it, or the author is really trying to hide real identity, so everybody knows Kinder album, and when vernissage happened, nobody knows who is the artist. So Kinder album was never presented, never introduced in person. Here is another picture from it. And here you can see the picture which is reflecting somehow on the views, on the news that Russian army is using a lot raping as a part of their repression policies against Ukrainian people. And for me, one of the most shocking documents or pieces I've seen about this, it was an article in Vogue Ukraine, this spring, How to Save Your Health After Rape. And I thought about, wow, when this topic is coming to popular culture products as Vogue, this is incredible, and this is this is very abnormal situation because everyone connects Vogue now with this, just luxurious lifestyle and consumeristic culture and so on. So when these tutorials became a part of Vogue, I feel something really, really deep and terrible going on. Here was a performative and political action happening in Prague by Ukrainian artist Kate Mamchur, which kind of reacting on the Russian army using rape as a weapon against civil population in Ukraine. And the idea was that she made a big research on the calls recorded in between Russian soldiers and their wives. And it was shocking somehow that Russian wives encouraged Russian soldiers, their husbands, to do some kind of like very violent stuff towards civilians. And she was using these records to write a manifesto and to kind of spotlight the crimes Russian army committing in Ukraine. So from the one side, it was this evidence of rape, and from the other side, it was huge evidence of stealing things from the Russian homes, which of course like became partly a meme because people after back home, after their like homes were deoccupied, were found that their personal stuff was gone, like their used underwear was gone. So using these two parts of news and war narrative, she created the action in which she and another girls dressed up as the brides were coming to Russian embassy and were reading together a manifesto against Russian army using rape and looting against civilian population, and was leaving private underwear on the fence as a part of evidence and as a part of the performance manifesto speech. It is very often when places where something bad and terrifying happen became rethinked and became places for culture initiatives and art. And I found out that it is a very much opposite thing happened in the one cultural hub in Ukraine, which was called isolation. And when Russian army occupied Donetsk region, the cultural center Izolatia became an illegal prison. So the place where, like some time ago, where performances and galleries now became kind of torturing spot and prison. And it is a map reconstructed from the memories of people who survived and or who managed to run out from there, and it shows like what happened now in cafeteria, in cultural center, ex-cultural center, what happened now in the exhibitions place. And all these documentations are extremely important, and hopefully they will be used as a big part of the evidence against Russia after the world will end. And it is a few ongoing websites where people can upload evidences of damage, of war crimes, of any crimes committed by Russian army, and then this evidence will be used in the criminal suit in Gag, hopefully. So it's open for all people in Ukraine to contribute their photos there, or comments or stories, whatever. And yeah, sometimes I open this website to check what's going on with in my home, and it's yeah, it's very special and strange feeling to see updates and to be afraid, but also yeah, scared to see the name of your town on this website. From the horror news to a bit better news, one of the first cultural related news after the open invasion started was news about Maria Primachenko Museum. Maria Primachenko is probably the most famous naive artist from Ukraine in the 20th century. Her biography is very special because she was let go abroad with her shows by Soviet government. So Soviet government considered she is a safe artist, so she had a chance to present her art outside the Soviet Union. I knew her pictures as a mostly folklore-based pictures, like flowers and butterflies, and I think it also was part of this Soviet curating that they choose like the most neutral somehow pictures or the most positive ones. But then this year I discovered that she actually was reflecting a lot events of 20th century and events like Cold War or Chernobyl catastrophe or nuclear war possibility. So here you can see a picture of her which calls me that nuclear war be cursed. And in March 2022, the museum of her in her hometown was completely damaged by Russian forces, so everyone were upset about we probably lost all Maria Primachenko or biggest part of her work. And then after months or a bit less than a month, it was found that local citizens, where they seen then Russian tanks are coming in this small town, they were running not to save their own stuff and goods and money or documents, but actually a lot of people ran in her museum and took a lot of her pictures with them. So the museum was damaged, but a lot of people then call and said that they actually have one or two Maria Primachenko in their homes. And this year, if you was in Venice Biennale, one of her works were exhibited there. It is Scarecrow, and it had absolutely genius and interesting curatorial insight. So according to curator of Venice Biennale, Scarecrow represents and embodied any kind of aggressor in any kind of war. So it's from the one side, it's kind of monster, but from the other side, it's kind of ridiculous monster, kind of funny one, which is not really a danger, but more a scarecrow function. When archiving news about culture, I was very interested to archive also preserving rituals or protecting rituals. And here you can see a few. One, of course, is this sand bags to preserve ancient stone idols, the culture which is rooted in Bronze Age. And another one is tape patterns on the windows. And tape patterns, for me, it's very interesting and also semi-cargo thing that, of course, there are no any guarantee that tape on the window can protect you from the big explosion wave or from the explosion. But this taped windows somehow works as calming rituals, or the rituals which brings you feeling you did something for your safety. And it's extremely popular all around Ukraine, and it's so many tutorials exist, like if you Google about which pattern is right and which pattern it protects the best. And I really like to check it because sometimes it's very creative ideas appears and somebody recommends a snowflake one or somebody recommends crosses or lines. And I know it's probably have no any big rationality in it, but it definitely works as a moral support somehow. Here you can see more developed protection and support ritual or design code for preserving cultural objects in Ukraine during the wartime. So it's one of the latest projects by designers group Ukraine. And you can see one of propositions how it's possible to preserve the monument. So it will contain the graphic of it and some maybe historical facts. So even in the wartime, you can get some information or get some knowledge about cultural objects and processes. It is a big discussion in Ukraine since 2014, but now especially because things are getting very emotional, and discussion is about what to do with the Soviet monuments, or what to do with the monuments which are heroizing Soviet times, or with the monuments which was a part of Soviet propaganda and staying a part of Russian propaganda, as this 3 Russian unity monument I shown you. And there are 2 opinions. One says that it's a historical heritage and it can be damaged or removed, and we have to rethink it, or maybe like write some disclaimers, but it have to stay because it's part of the history. Another one says that if it became incredibly upsetting and traumatizing for already traumatizing population, then it's possible to remove it, and then it's needed to remove it. And this project is reacting on this discussion and staying somewhere in between. And it's called Contraception or Death. And this project contains the plastic, huge plastic bag somehow, huge plastic condom, and a small note for neighbors and passerbys, which says, "Hello, we are artistic collective, and we were thinking about what we shall do with the monuments which are heroizing Soviet times in Ukraine. And we don't know what to do yet, but we would like to protect ourselves from their propaganda features and their propaganda power, and from the traumatizing past as well. So we were living here this back in the hope protect ourselves from their evil power, evil potential." Here is another project I really appreciate. It was exhibited in Berlin this year, and it's called Temple of Transfiguration. And in this project, in this simple installation, you can see a monster object made from 2 parts. One is top from the Orthodox Church temple, and another one is a military wagon. And together it's represent this unity and this collaboration of Russian military machine and Russian Orthodox Church, which unfortunately encouraging a lot for militarization and getting involved into filtration cap system for Ukrainians in Russia, and justifying crimes of Russian army in Ukraine. When I talking about monstrous connection of church and military machine, I always think about this photo I found this year, where Russian Orthodox priests are blessing the huge rocket, also known as a Satan. So I thought that shouldn't be real, but it is. And so here is a picture how priest is blessing Satan. Another thing I really wanted to show, and I was always forgetting in the previous lectures, I was very happy I didn't lose it this time. It's the main cathedral of Russian armed forces. It's pretty fresh, and it's absolutely unbelievable construction. So first of all, a lot of elements were done from symbolical materials like leftovers of German tanks from the Second World War. Inside you can see a lot of mosaics which are picturing Orthodox saints, but also soldiers. And I get my interest about this temple because of the first news about two mosaics which were published. And on the first one, you can see was pictured Stalin. And on the second one, here, it was pictured Putin and another politicians which were involved into Crimea occupation. And here you can see the transparent which says Крым наш, which means Crimea is ours, and Навеки с Россией, which means forever with Russia. So this mosaics is actually supposed to be a part of this Orthodox temple. And after some scandalous comments appear, some changes were done, and now there are not in this full original concept. So Stalin disappeared, and instead of Putin and few politicians, the small icon appear. But even after these changes, I would say it's giving pretty surreal and bizarre feeling, because there are a lot of weapons pictured on the mosaics in this temple, together with angels blessing it from the top. And basically every mosaic symbolizes some victorious war where Russian army was involved. And I choose this one because this one symbolizes a lot of wars. And one of them is, I will find it now. So it's Korean War, conflicts in Yemen, in Vietnam, in Egypt, in Syria, Mozambique, in Czechoslovakia. So I was thinking, this is very insane that somewhere in 2022, it is a temple exists where it is a mosaic which is picturing victorious wars, and one of them is occupation of Czechoslovakia. I wanted to finish this lecture with some positive boost, or maybe with some heart-warming projects and hope. And here is a project I very like, but by Ukrainian artist Yulia Krivich. She is now currently living in Poland, and she is involved into social center Sunflower. And one of her art projects this year was to encourage people to grow sunflowers in their cities, which from the one side, which really help bees and another bugs and just biodiversity in the cities, and from the other side, will hopefully remember people about events and processes going now in Ukraine. And then I seen very nice documentation of sunflowers growing in some random places all around Poland. Another thing I really wanted to recommend or share, it's a Making of Modern Ukraine course by Timothy Snyder, and every lecture is published online, and it's extremely deep and well explained lectures. So if you will feel like got some more info or share some info with somebody, I think this is an amazing source. And instead of last word, I wanted to read the name of one of the pictures by Maria Primachenko, which was preserved this year, which survived the damaging fire in her museum. And this painting have very long and very beautiful title. It says, "I present blue flowers to sailors so that they will be strong. I wish all our guardians happiness, that the sun shine above our heads, that there will be peace over us." And I think it will be perfect ending for the lecture. If you have some questions, I'm here for you. You can ask it now or in less formal environment. I'm very up to it. I also speak Czech, so don't hesitate. And thank you so much for listening. And I very much believe that getting to know something more about Ukrainian culture, it's a real contribution against Russian imperialism, because this war is a cultural war, and by spreading the word about Ukrainian culture, it's actually a big help. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darja, for your great lecture. And some questions?
Maybe I have one. I know that you are not part of the Russian community, but I've heard that Russian people have at their home only a few TV channels which rewrite and rethink what West and Middle Europe says about Ukrainian war. Is it right, or is it just hope?
I think that Russian TV channels are very much curated by Russian government. It's much more than two, but all of them are like following propaganda narratives, and all of them are creating very fictional picture of reality. So for people who limit their sources of information with the TV, of course, this is some like bizarre picture of the world exists, and about like countries in the Europe and about USA, but still internet sources are not closed. So it will be wrong to say that Russian people don't have information until now what's going on. It is pretty much clear that almost like all population in the big cities are aware, unfortunately, what's going on.
Any questions? No? Okay. Yeah, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you.